becomes kind of like the model for the creation of whiteness and the corresponding disempowerment of people of color as well as women. So a rebellion wouldn't have been bloodless, and even if armed, you'd still be facing an army. So even if you had succeeded, you still had to feed people, have an economy, trade, sovereignty. And sovereignty means you can stand on your own against physical attack, and you have to have your own language, customs, history, and economy, which you also defend. So part of where I'm, kind of bringing this out of temporal sequence, but also to give the idea that the Civil War was basically the only solution, because if you can't legislatively get rid of slavery, like the radical Republicans wanted, if you're not going to give all the blacks that are living in the United States a separate homeland, like Virginia or the South, if you can't, because Lincoln persisted in the idea of sending blacks to Costa Rica until about 3 months before his death, and a general told them, look, even if you took all our Navy ships, because we can't fit all of them on our Navy ships, even if you basically impressed into service all of the ships that are available as merchant ships as well as our Navy, by the time you get them to Costa Rica, because remember, there's no Panama Canal then, so you have to go around the coast of South America and come back up. By the time you do that, the blacks that you've shipped off will be replaced by the blacks that remain. In terms of the birth rate, not going to happen. Give it up. Just make them citizens. It's easier. So a lot of solutions are happening in terms of looking at what are the solutions to this pattern of discrimination, slavery, etc. So, for example, the reason one of the things that's holding slavery in place, of course, is economics. So this is 170, I believe, in to make our world anew. The economy, sell what they need, and they need clothing, cotton, the look and feel of cotton. That commercial, the fabric of our lives. So slaves might have been set free by debt and conscience-ridden Chesapeake planters, were instead sold to the planters of the cotton-growing states of the lower South. Slaves were property, and thus, like any usable object, could be sold into a booming economy. So let's see. Right. In case you don't have your book handy. Now we're sitting. Really? Oh, has to wake up. So the Negro in his own country, above, right? So here's the image, the Negro in his own country. So here he is, dressed for the weather, got his spear. Not sure what this is, it's a skeleton, right? Skeleton's unburied, so do civilized people bury or leave their dead out to rot? They bury them, okay? So that's the visual grammar, right? A Negro in his own country. And then Negro in America. Clothed in Western fashion. Getting Bible lessons. from Massa. And there's this gulf. The Bible defense of slavery. So Southern owners believed the blacks could benefit, they benefited from slavery. Yes, 177. White woman whips a slave, probably a house servant. Violent attacks come from any direction at any time. Valuable slaves. And using religion as a tool. Plantation owner and his family attend church services with their slaves. Slaveholders tried to use religion as a tool to more fully dominate the lives of their slaves. So what my grandfather told me is when naturally what they're using as a text is the King James Version of the Bible, that even though there were these plantation church meetings, because remember what, they're not allowing black people, or certainly not allowing slaves to participate in integrated church services. As Martin Luther King even observed in the 20th century, Sunday is still the most segregated time in America. Part of where black liberation theology came from in terms of the earliest writings found in the 1820s was the notion that we're using, if we're going to have to use the King James Version of the Bible, we're only going to use the red letter version, that is the words of Jesus himself, and we're going to use an African or i.e. a black version of Jesus. But if we're forced to use the text, King James Version, we're only going to use what Jesus said, period. Not Paul, because what Massa basically said is you need to be good slaves and stay in slavery. Don't revolt, and then you'll get your reward in the great by and by. Meanwhile, we can whip you and rape you and all that other kind of stuff, and we'll be forgiven. I mean, literally saying that. Because, Fugitive Song, composed by a young Frederick Douglass, as a tribute to Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery to become a revered abolitionist, newspaper editor, and lecturer. So notice what he's carrying. This is kind of like a staff and kind of like I don't know if you've ever seen the representations of a hobo, which is basically Depression era agricultural workers. Hobo means hoe boys, so they're migrant agricultural workers. Somebody who has no permanent place to live and wanders from place to place. Somebody who survives by asking for food or money. Relating to characteristic of a vagabond. So basically he's referring to Douglass as wandering from place to place in the service of freeing people, though that could also be pejorative too. So one of the things that happens as a result of this indoctrination that we begin to look at in terms of formulating the African American experience is that many writers begin to look at racism as a mental illness. We haven't talked about this yet, right? Okay. So, literature that focuses on the development of racism and racial attitudes indicates that children can be infected with racism as early as age 4. Now, it's my words, and I'm basically using the concept of mimetics. So when the literature that focuses on racial attitudes, where that comes from, is that a lot of times there's actually a book by Judy Katz, Racism as a Mental Illness. So Judy is I believe Jewish psychologist who talks about racism as a mental illness. I think that's the name of her book. And she cites some of the literature, because this book was written in the mid to late 80s. So as early as age 4, white children had already internalized feelings of superiority. The preference for being white and negative attitudes towards black were found not to be as a result of direct contact, but as a result of subtle communications from parents, teachers, the media, which the media is also basically schools and school lessons, and so on. So, for example, what I just showed you in the book, I mean, this is like, even though you may not have ever seen something like this is part of the educational system of the time that really didn't get interrupted or challenged publicly until ethnic studies. Privately, we did. So privately, part of my home training was essentially given a counter-narrative. Slaves were smart. Slaves learned to read. We had to teach ourselves to learn to read when it was a death sentence, because it often was, because of the fear of slave revolts. And we started looking at not only the literature around medicine, around mental illness, so as early as age 4. So preference for the color white and negative connotations about the color black were found not only in very young white children, but also transferred over to the black children as well. So Kenneth and Mamie Clark, whose work was quoted in the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, which we won't get to until we study the 20th century, but one of the things they did is their famous doll study. Like, which is the smart doll, which is the dumb doll, which is, et cetera, right? And found the same results regardless of the race of the children. So, whether one accepts racism as a mental illness or not, how one handles racism is a major health factor affecting black mental, physical, spiritual, political, and economic health. So, as an example, so we didn't really start formulating that until like the 20th century, other than people like Delaney and Douglass. So, this is Frederick Douglass. What is the 4th of July to a slave? Whether return to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call into question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that served to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command. And yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right or and just. So Mr. Obama should read Douglass, not Lincoln. Sojourner Truth's famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? So this is delivered 1851 at the Women's Convention in Akron. They actually didn't want to admit her. Because even though she'd spoke before at other places, they didn't want to admit her because black women didn't speak out. So they made her take off her shirt to prove she had breasts. These are white feminists. Early white feminists. Black women couldn't speak out. Prove she had breasts. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Member of the audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says, women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it, the men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. You go, sis. Let's stop here. Buffalo Soldiers is after the Civil War. All right. See you Wednesday. Thanks.
Just
digest.